Welcome to our channel. Before we get started, please consider liking and subscribing so we can bring more stories like this to you. When I first moved into the Maple Grove Estates community, I thought I'd struck gold. The houses were charming, with big bay windows and perfectly kept lawns. The streets were lined with leafy maple trees that formed a canopy over the sidewalks, making for pleasant evening walks. It was a picturesque suburban neighborhood, the sort you'd see in a holiday movie. But there was one thing I hadn't accounted for: the HOA, and more specifically, Karen, the self-appointed queen of Maple Grove. I found out about Karen the very first morning I stepped outside with my coffee. I was greeted by a startlingly loud knock at my front door. She was there with a clipboard in her hands and a bright pink visor perched atop her carefully styled hair. There was no introduction, no welcome. Instead, she thrust a piece of paper into my hand listing the rules for new residents, some of which I had never even heard mentioned in my lease agreement or in the official HOA packet I'd received. According to Karen, the official guidelines didn't fully capture the community spirit of Maple Grove. She proudly announced that her personal list was derived from her many years of dedicated service on the HOA board. I glanced over the paper. No outside furniture that clashed with the community's color scheme, no garden ornaments taller than 2 feet, no wind chimes of any sort after 8 p.m. Some were innocuous enough, things like keeping your lawn trimmed made sense, but others were baffling. For instance, there was a rule stipulating that any vehicle left in the driveway for more than 72 consecutive hours would be subject to towing. Another specified that garbage bins had to be of an approved shade of green. None of this was in the official HOA documents, but Karen insisted it had always been implied. Karen's attitude was condescending from the get-go. She kept referring to me as dear, even though I'm well into my 50s. When I tried to ask questions, she'd wave me off and say things like, "Trust me, dear, we don't want any trouble here, do we?" The entire exchange left me unsettled, but I decided to take it in stride. After all, it was my first day, and I didn't want to start off on the wrong foot. That evening, I got another taste of Karen's influence. The community had a small welcome tradition, apparently organized by the HOA, where new residents were invited to a potluck at the clubhouse. I was keen to go, both to meet my neighbors and to see if Karen's bristling personality was just a one-time thing. I baked a tray of brownies and showed up around 6, expecting a friendly get-together. Karen was the first person to intercept me. Her smile looked genuine from a distance, but the moment she recognized me, it morphed into something like polite disapproval. She commended me on my punctuality, then steered me toward the food table while making small talk about the responsibilities of new residents, emphasizing how Maple Grove's aesthetic needed to remain consistent. It was like she was reading bullet points from a script. For a moment, I thought I might be the only one who found her manner off-putting, until I ended up sitting next to a friendly retired couple, Jenny and Paul. After we'd exchanged pleasantries, Paul rolled his eyes subtly in Karen's direction. He whispered, "Don't let her rattle you. She's been on the board for years and acts like she owns the place." Jenny chimed in, "She's harmless most of the time, but if you give her any excuse to make your life difficult, she'll take it. Some of the other board members can be strict, but Karen takes it to a whole new level." Relieved that I wasn't alone in my observations, I joined the rest of the evening's casual banter. Overall, the residents seemed down-to-earth: teachers, retirees, a few small business owners. People like me, basically. But Karen hovered throughout the event, listening in on conversations and interjecting whenever she spotted something that didn't align with her vision for the neighborhood. Before I headed home, Karen pulled me aside one last time. She mentioned that she'd be dropping by to inspect my backyard soon. She wanted to ensure I was adhering to the rules about hedges, water features, and pet enclosures. I tried to politely protest that I didn't have any pets or water features, but she only nodded curtly, scribbled something on her clipboard, and disappeared into the crowd. It was unsettling, but I convinced myself it was just typical HOA overreach. Little did I know that this was only the tip of the iceberg. A couple of weeks after the potluck, I was settling into life at Maple Grove. My lawn was manicured, my trash bin was the correct shade of green, thanks to a quick coat of paint. And I had even befriended Jenny and Paul, the retired couple who'd offered me a heads-up about Karen's meddling. Things seemed peaceful, until I woke one morning to find a neon pink notice taped to my door. It wasn't an official HOA notice, just a piece of construction paper with huge block letters scrawled in black marker, lawn border violation. My heart raced, and I scoured the perimeter of my yard, trying to figure out what on earth I could have done wrong. I saw nothing amiss. The grass was trimmed, the walkway was clear, and my flower bed, though modest, was neat. Confused, I decided to ask Jenny and Paul if they'd received anything similar. When I arrived at their house, Jenny was on her porch sipping tea, a look of annoyance creasing her brow. She was holding a near-identical pink notice. "Would you look at this nonsense?" she exclaimed. "Apparently, our rose bushes are too close to the property line." She rolled her eyes so hard I thought they might get stuck. Paul joined us, chuckling grimly. She must be on another one of her crusades. We all knew who she was. Karen was the only one who used pink paper for these sorts of warnings, which were never official but always threatening. Official HOA notices came in plain white envelopes, typed and signed by the board. Pink was Karen's personal brand, and these notices often preceded her lobbying the board to issue legitimate citations if you didn't comply. My violation, it turned out, was due to the small row of decorative rocks that lined my driveway. They were apparently a potential tripping hazard because they extended half an inch over the property line that separated my driveway from the communal sidewalk. It sounded ridiculous, but I knew that ignoring it would only escalate matters. Paul nodded sympathetically. "We've all been there, mate. Best you can do is remove them, or she'll cause a stir at the next HOA meeting." The next day, armed with a shovel and a wheelbarrow, I moved the rocks so they were well inside my boundary. I planned to keep the peace, or at least not give Karen anything to complain about. However, my hopes of staying off her radar were dashed when I discovered that she had installed new security cameras on her front porch, seemingly aimed right at my driveway. It wasn't just me, she'd positioned cameras to watch multiple neighboring properties. When I confronted her about it, she told me the cameras were for community safety, her smile so sweetly venomous that I practically tasted the saccharine bitterness. Then came the fiasco with my compost bin. I've always been an avid gardener, so I maintain a small compost barrel in my backyard. This wasn't prohibited in the HOA guidelines, at least not explicitly. But Karen found it unsightly. She left another pink note, lambasting me for introducing potential odors and rodents. She even claimed that I was threatening the entire community's sanitary standards. Of course, this was absurd. My compost setup was tidy, well-sealed, and well away from public view. I decided I'd had enough. Instead of quietly complying, I wanted to challenge her. I reached out to the actual HOA board via email, explaining that I had no intention of removing my compost bin and that if there was a real rule against it, I'd like to see it in writing. The board's vice president, an older gentleman named Richard, responded kindly. He acknowledged receiving other complaints about Karen's extra-official guidelines and said he would bring up my concerns at the next board meeting. In the meantime, tension bubbled. Karen would walk by my house and take photos of my backyard over the fence, letting me know she was cataloging every detail. I tried to ignore her as best I could, but it was increasingly uncomfortable. Neighbors also came forward with their own horror stories. One single mother, Beth, had been targeted because her teen son sometimes skateboarded on their driveway. Karen claimed it attracted unwanted youth and asked the board to consider banning skateboarding on all communal sidewalks. Another neighbor, Mark, was harassed for using an outdoor grill that allegedly created too much smoke. By the time the next HOA meeting rolled around, the entire community seemed on edge. Several neighbors, exasperated by Karen's meddling, planned to attend. It was rare for so many homeowners to show up in person, but we all felt like this was our chance to address the elephant in the room. Little did we know that Karen had anticipated this gathering and had come armed with a thick binder of evidence. The meeting was held on a Monday evening in the small community clubhouse. As we filed in, Karen sat at the long table at the front, flanked by the other board members. Her eyes flicked over us, and I noticed the corners of her mouth curve up in a smug grin. She clearly believed she was about to tighten her grip on Maple Grove Estates. But as it turned out, she had majorly underestimated just how fed up everyone was. The board meeting opened with the usual formalities, a roll call of members, a review of the last meeting's minutes, and a brief statement on the community's budget. Richard, the vice president, then opened the floor for new business. That's when Karen immediately cleared her throat and launched into a rehearsed spiel about the ongoing issues in the neighborhood. She held up her infamous pink binder and began flipping through pages. Her voice took on a pompous tone as she read off a list of alleged infractions: unsanctioned compost bins, improperly colored trash cans, vehicles parked on the curb for more than one day, and recreational activities that compromise Maple Grove's peaceful environment. With each bullet point, she'd pause dramatically and glance around the room, searching for support. But the usually silent crowd stared back, unmoved. No one applauded or nodded in agreement. Karen's brow furrowed in confusion. Richard cleared his throat, trying to steer things diplomatically. Karen, we appreciate your diligence, but many of these concerns aren't explicitly stated in the HOA's charter. If you'd like to propose new rules, we'll need to follow the proper procedures. We can't just enforce personal preference. Karen looked flustered. She turned to the rest of us. These are not mere preferences. These are necessary measures to preserve our community. I've received countless complaints from residents. At that, a hand shot up from the back of the room. It was Mark, the neighbor who had been harassed for his grill. Excuse me, Karen, but I don't think you've received complaints from residents. You've been making them yourself. You've been pushing these pink notes on everyone and claiming they're official. That's not how the HOA works. The crowd murmured in agreement. Karen blanched, but she still clung to her bravado. Well, the job's not getting done otherwise. I'm only trying to help, she protested, her voice wavering slightly. Before she could continue, Beth, the single mother, took the floor. Karen, I understand wanting to keep the neighborhood nice. But banning my son from skateboarding in our own driveway? That's absurd. He's not harming anyone, and he's not on community property when he does it. Karen's frustration was palpable. She fumbled with her binder, flipping pages as if to find a rule to prove her point. Unable to produce one, she glared at Beth. It's disruptive, she insisted. It lowers property values when we have teenagers playing extreme sports. At that, nearly everyone started speaking at once. The tension spilled over, and the typically orderly HOA meeting took on the air of a heated town hall. Jenny stood up and called for civility, while Paul demanded that the board address Karen's unauthorized cameras, which were infringing on people's privacy. Another neighbor complained about her midnight patrols, where she'd roam the streets to check for lights left on or cars parked incorrectly. A mild-mannered older woman spoke up, shaking with anger, about how Karen had pestered her over a small statue in her front garden, an heirloom that had belonged to her late husband. Karen, overwhelmed, tried to regain control. She tapped her microphone, the echo vibrating through the room. Everyone, please. These regulations are for your benefit. But the chorus of dissent only grew louder. A final straw came when a middle-aged gentleman, someone I hadn't even met, calmly announced that he'd filed a formal complaint about Karen's harassment with the county. The hush that fell over the room was deafening. Richard, looking increasingly uncomfortable, banged his gavel softly. All right, enough. We need order here. Once the room settled, he sighed. Karen, it appears the board has received multiple complaints regarding your actions, which overstepped the authority granted to individual board members. We are going to hold a vote on whether to issue you a formal reprimand and to temporarily suspend your role pending an investigation. Karen's eyes went wide. Her face turned beet red, and she lurched to her feet so violently that her chair tipped over. You can't do that, she sputtered, voice cracking. I've been the backbone of this HOA for years. But her protests fell on deaf ears. The other board members exchanged glances and voted. The decision was unanimous. An official letter of censure would be issued, and Karen would lose her voting rights and responsibilities until the matter was resolved. The rest of us sat in stunned silence. Karen stormed out of the clubhouse in a huff, binder clutched to her chest. In the days that followed, the community atmosphere improved almost overnight. Neighbors began chatting on sidewalks without fear of being photographed. Kids played in driveways without being glared at. My compost bin remained exactly where it was, undisturbed. As for Karen, she remained in her house, blinds drawn, and her porch cameras conspicuously disappeared one morning. Some speculated she'd gotten a stern letter from the local authorities. Others believed she'd simply realized how much trouble she'd stirred up. When she did venture out, it was to collect her mail or drive away, avoiding eye contact with everyone. A month later, the board met again to finalize new guidelines that clearly prohibited invasive surveillance on neighbors and spelled out transparent procedures for issuing violations. Richard, though courteous, was firm. No more pink paper warnings, no more personal vendettas disguised as community care. For me, it was vindication. Maple Grove Estates finally felt like the welcoming neighborhood I'd envisioned when I first moved in. While Karen's meltdown might not have been as dramatic as what you see on some YouTube channels, it was a stark reminder of how easily one person can dominate a community if they are unchecked. But it was also a lesson in the power of unity. By standing together, sharing stories, and demanding accountability, we turned the tide against Karen's tyranny. Today, the only reminders of that chaotic period are the pink notices some neighbors jokingly keep pinned on their fridges, souvenirs of the time we all decided enough was enough.